Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a highly controversial, incredibly complex document known as the Scientific Indictment. Our goal here? To conduct a strict, totally impartial forensic audit of the text. This document lays out a hardcore structural, chemical, and even esoteric teardown of the official 9/11 narrative. Now, we aren't here to endorse these views or take sides. We're just here to break down exactly what this text argues using the clear evidence it presents. Right off the bat, the text drops this massive claim. It immediately frames the whole event not as some random intelligence failure, but as a heavily planned operation. The author writes that it was a coordinated, state-sponsored mega ritual and calls it the new Titanic. That is a wild thesis to start with, but it perfectly sets the stage for a narrative that blends hardcore structural physics with the manipulation of global consciousness. So, to unpack all of this objectively, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the overarching motive in the new Titanic, then dig into the stark thermal physics of the collapse, check out the visual signatures of demolition, examine the Nano-Thermite proof, and finally, wrap up with the esoteric theory behind it all. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, what the document calls the new Titanic. You've probably heard of the Hegelian Dialectic before, right? Problem, reaction, solution. Well, the document argues the system completely relies on this. It's the deliberate engineering of massive trauma to basically paralyze our collective consciousness. And while everyone is in that state of shock, draconian control mechanisms get smoothly installed. According to this text, 9/11 was executed using this exact dialectic. Just like the sinking of the Titanic was allegedly used to push through the Federal Reserve, 9/11 was designed to ignite a perpetual war machine, secure the petrodollar, and lock in the legal architecture for a borderless surveillance state. Okay, moving on to Section 2. This is where things get super granular. The text shifts entirely from geopolitics to hardcore architectural physics, taking a sledgehammer to the official pancake collapse narrative. The whole argument begins with a really stark thermal reality. Think about the temperatures for a second. The official narrative says jet fuel was the catalyst, right? But jet fuel burns at a maximum of about 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Now compare that to the melting point of the massive structural steel columns used in those towers, which is 2,750 degrees Fahrenheit. It's almost double. The text points out this massive cognitive dissonance, arguing that localized office fires and jet fuel simply cannot cause the total, catastrophic failure of redundant steel columns that need vastly more heat to actually melt. And that leads right into the next major physical hurdle, the sheer impossibility of symmetrical damage. Look, even if we play devil's advocate and assume the fires miraculously weakened that steel, the law of least resistance still kicks in. The planes hit asymmetrically. The fires were localized. So the buildings absolutely should have tipped, tilted, or toppled asymmetrically toward the point of damage. But they didn't. Instead, all three buildings came down perfectly, mathematically straight down through the path of greatest resistance. Which brings us to what the document considers the ultimate smoking gun, free-fall acceleration. By definition, free-fall means an object is dropping with literally zero physical resistance from below. The text points out that towers 1, 2, and 7 all came down at or near free-fall. In a normal gravity-driven collapse, the falling upper portion has to use up a massive amount of kinetic energy to crush the thousands of tons of intact steel and concrete beneath it. That resistance would significantly slow the fall. So the text argues that free fall is mathematically impossible unless thousands of tons of underlying structural steel were somehow simultaneously and explosively removed. So, if gravity and office fires couldn't cause a perfectly symmetrical free fall, what exactly did? Let's hit Section 3 and look at what the author calls the undeniable visual signatures of controlled demolition. Have you ever heard of Squibs? According to the document, video evidence from that day clearly shows these horizontal, high-velocity bursts of pulverized concrete and steel blasting right out of the windows. And we aren't just talking right at the collapse line. We're talking 20, 40, even 60 stories below the descending wave. The text frames these ejections as the exact visual footprint of synchronized explosive charges cutting the core support columns way ahead of the falling mass. But the anomalies don't stop with the Twin Towers. The document highlights what it calls the most arrogant media failure of the entire event, the timeline for Building 7. WTC-7 was a massive 47-story skyscraper. It wasn't even hit by a plane, yet it collapsed perfectly into its own footprint. And the timeline is staggering. At 5 p.m., major networks like CNN and the BBC reported on live television that Building 7 had collapsed. But Building 7 didn't actually fall until 5:20 p.m. There is literal broadcast footage where the reporter is announcing its collapse while the building is standing completely intact in the window right behind her. The author claims this absolutely proves the media was operating on a pre-written script that accidentally fell out of sync with the actual demolition. All right, Section 4. If these buildings were actually brought down by a synchronized demolition, there has to be chemical proof, right? Well, the document presents some very specific forensic evidence here. The text leans heavily on a 2009 peer-reviewed study led by an international team of scientists, prominently featuring Dr. Niels Harrit. This study, published in the Open Chemical Physics Journal, ran a hardcore analysis on multiple dust samples collected directly from ground zero. And what they found is pretty staggering. The team discovered these highly engineered, unreacted chips mixed into the dust. They identified them as nano-thermitic composite materials. Just to give you some context, Nano-Thermite is a military-grade high-tech explosive. It is specifically designed to slice through steel on contact like a hot knife through butter. According to the document, the presence of this unreacted nano-thermite in the dust is the definitive, irrefutable chemical fingerprint of a controlled demolition operation. Okay, so we've gone through the structural physics and the chemical arguments. Now we hit Section 5. This is where the text takes a really sharp pivot into what it calls the Gnostic Indictment, diving deep into the esoteric motive behind the entire event. This introduces a totally wild metaphysical concept to explain the why: ambrosia Loosh. The text describes Loosh as this incredibly potent, low-frequency emotional energy. Think pure terror, trauma, and despair that actually gets harvested from us during moments of extreme psychological shock. The claim here is that broadcasting the planes hitting the towers globally over and over again wasn't just standard news coverage. It was a calculated trauma induction program deliberately designed to generate a massive planetary harvest of this emotional energy to feed parasitic forces. And this esoteric angle even extends to the physical targets themselves. The document draws a very specific symbolic comparison. On one hand, you have the Twin Towers. On the other, the Masonic pillars of Boaz and Jachin, which traditionally represent the gateway to the mysteries. The author argues that publicly and ritually destroying these specific symbolic pillars was no accident. It was meant to signal the violent, definitive end of the old world order. Which brings us to the final Gnostic verdict presented by the text. It states, they did not just bring down the buildings, they brought down the resonant frequency of the entire planet to lock the doors of the black iron prison. Ultimately, the document concludes that this mega ritual was an absolute success. It paralyzed our collective consciousness, used that global trauma to permanently alter the Earth's frequency, and kicked off an entirely new era of endless war and absolute control. So as we wrap up this explainer, we want to leave you with a really provocative thought straight from this text's forensic audit. If the basic laws of thermal physics and structural engineering were completely bypassed on live television, what other fundamental realities of our modern world are just running on a carefully engineered script? Again, we are absolutely not here to tell you what to believe. We're just laying out the blueprint of this document. What's your takeaway from this stark comparison of official narratives and physical realities? Keep asking questions, keep examining the data, and we'll see you next time.